these questions. And so, motivated by these issues, I created and curated a series hosted by Just Security on Racing National Security, which ran from July 13th to August 7th of this year. And several contributions in the series advocated forcefully for stretching the parameters of national security. And we are blessed and honored to have a number of those contributors here with us today. And so today we're trying to continue the important conversation sparked by the online series that was really building on longstanding work from some that have really been tirelessly working to center race in national security discussions and conversations where race has primarily tended to be marginalized. And so the symposium and this event build on that work that is writing against and speaking against the dominant paradigm which seeks to marginalize race. And so the tendency to background and to center race in conventional scholarship on national security is one that can be seen simply by just glancing at a book on US foreign relations law or national security law. You will likely not see issues implicating race at all. Such discussions, to the extent they happen, are typically relegated to a single chapter or even a short segment, if at all. And this backgrounding may in part be influenced by the state-centric nature of much of the discipline in the practice, seeing as the state as a primary unit may tend to shift attention away from macro structural processes that facilitate racial subordination and stratification transnationally, and sort of a general reading of that. However, the absence of racial analysis from racial security conventionally may also occur because of the erroneous view that important quote unquote matters of national security obviate the need for considerations of race. So race is supposed to sort of be subsumed underneath the larger umbrella of national security. However, failing to see race and engage with race obscures the role of racism and structural racism, as well as the role of white supremacy in national security. And so the symposium, Racing National Security, and this event seeks to challenge that paradigm. And we are really excited to introduce the contributors from some of the contributors from the series that are going to be teasing out some of their pieces here in conversation with us today. So without further ado, let me introduce our very dynamic and powerful lineup of author panelists. First, Professor Asla Vali at the UCLA School of Law, who is the faculty director of the UCLA Promise Institute for Human Rights. Her principal scholarly interests lie in two areas, both public international law, which includes human rights law and the law of international security order, as well as comparative constitutional law. She has taught at the Yale Law School as a visitor most recently. She is co-editor of Constitution, Writing, Religion, and Democracy in the forthcoming volume, From Revolution to Devolution, Identity, Conflict, Governance, and Decentralization in the Middle East. She currently serves as the co-chair of the advisory board for the Middle East Division of Human Rights Watch, is a chair of the Task Force on Civil and Human Rights in the Middle East Studies Association, and she is a graduate of Williams College, Cambridge University, Yale Law School, and Princeton University. We also have joining us Professor Monica Bell, who is an associate professor at Yale Law School and an associate professor of sociology at Yale University. Her areas of research include law and sociology, law and equality, policing, and the criminal legal system, welfare and public benefits law, housing law, and residential segregation and race in the law. Her scholarship has appeared in the Yale Law Journal, the American Journal of Sociology, NYU Law Review, the Law and Society Review, Harvard Civil Rights, Civil Liberties Law Review, and other journals. She has also published writing in popular outlets such as the Los Angeles Review of Books, the Washington Post, and The Appeal. Last but certainly not least, we have Professor Nora Urquhart, who is a human rights attorney and an assistant professor at Rutgers University, New Brunswick Department of Africana Studies. Her research interests include humanitarian law, refugee law, national security law, and critical race theory. She's an editorial committee member of the Ezine Jadvilia. She is the author of Justice for Some, Law as Politics in the Question of Palestine, and Nora is a co-editor of Aborted State, the UN Initiative, and New Palestinian Junctures. She has served as legal counsel for a congressional subcommittee in the House of Representatives, as a legal advocate for the Badil Resource Center for Palestinian Refugee and Residency Rights, and as a national grassroots organizer and legal advocate at the U.S. campaign to end the Israeli occupation. She's a graduate of the University of California at Berkeley and Georgetown University Law Center. So I wanted to start the conversation, if we could today, by beginning with Professor Bali. Professor Bali, in your Just Security piece, Defund America's Endless Wars, you examine the relationship between militarized policing at home and America's wars abroad, and argued that calls to defund the police should be tied to demands to endless wars. Can you briefly discuss this relationship with us? You're on mute.
So sorry. Thank you, first of all, for the introduction, Matiangai, and for bringing us together, and also for creating the opportunity in Just Security to have a forum on the subject, which has, as you said, absolutely been attended by silence typically in all national security fora. So this was really just a path-breaking opportunity, and I hope does continue to spur conversations like this one. My contribution was really inspired by the fact that in the moment that I was thinking about the question of racial justice and national security, I was confronted by the events of this summer, and notably the president describing lawlessness in Portland as worse than Afghanistan to justify the deploying of federal officers in that city using militarized policing techniques. And this seemed like a great opportunity to really reflect on the connections between domestic militarized policing and the ever multiplying foreign wars that the United States was committed to, because reconceiving security at home, in my view, requires a break from America's military posture abroad. So let me just explain a little bit what I do in the piece and why I make this case. Endless war, the military posture of constant ever-ready intervention by the United States is predicated on a view of the rest of the world as lawless, as an anarchic and brutal place that requires the United States to use force, often to humanitarian ends. Not just President Trump, but also President Obama has endorsed this vision, notably in his Nobel speech. President Obama noted that the United States is often called upon to use the instruments of war to preserve the peace. This logic of purportedly humanitarian uses of force has actually entailed a form of peace that is pacification through the use of force, typically policing communities of color, Black and brown communities abroad through counterinsurgency tactics and more recently counterterrorism, with overwhelming force. One of the premises of US deployment of force abroad is that there is a doctrine of zero casualties on the American side, which means even when force is being used for humanitarian ends, it's the civilians on the ground that bear the brunt of the violence. So state violence and interventions abroad become laboratories for, as I said, counterinsurgency, but also counterterrorism techniques that themselves end up being imported back into domestic policing on the very same logic of the need to bring law and order to a lawless area, but this time with respect to communities of color at home. So imperial interventions against unruly and restive Black and brown communities abroad become militarized policing of communities of color at home. And just one example of this that I lay out in the piece has to do with SWAT teams and the use of no-knock warrants, something that was innovated and developed first through techniques in the Philippines and then in Vietnam, and then brought to the United States in the late 1960s, and I detail that history. But it's not just techniques, weapons, and personnel that circulate between wars abroad and at home, although it is very much techniques, weapons, and personnel. It's also the conceptualization and practices of racializing the targets of state violence. So again, here, let me just take counterterrorism as an example. Muslims come to be conceived as incubators of threat, national security threat, outside of the United States, and then Muslim Americans are transposed and become the enemy within. And anybody indeed that might be mistaken for Muslim, that is someone who might be mistaken for Arab, Middle Eastern, South Asian, African, or African-American Muslim, can become subjected to practices of surveillance, preventive detention, even targeted killing here in, against US citizens. And the distillation of these strategies of disruption of the alleged threat, the purported threat represented by Muslims, is manifest in the Countering Violent Extremism program, which criminalizes ordinary indicia of Muslim identity as proxies for identifying threat, hence the racialization of threat. But these practices of racialization then migrate beyond the community they initially target. So other minority communities come to be, and marginalized groups come to be targeted, what we saw over the summer and what we've seen for a number of years now is the identification of so-called Black identity extremists as another manifestation of purported terroristic intent, which really amounts to the criminalization of dissent, as others have pointed out, including in the policing of social media as it's used by Black or Muslim dissident voices. When racial minorities and marginalized groups protest against the ways in which they're targeted by police brutality, when they resist the kind of criminalization that they're subjected to, this then engenders further police brutality, as we saw poignantly throughout the summer. This recursive logic of US wars at home and abroad is that violence breeds resistance, which then produces further violence, justifying the claim that there's a need to intervene against a lawless space. Wars on crime, drugs, terrorism reproduce racial enemies and then target enforcement in ways that reinforces that racial logic. So reconceiving policing at home requires reimagining public safety in ways that pushes towards demilitarization at home, shifts spending priorities, which is why the logic of it has been encapsulated by the phrase defund the police. But this is equally true with respect to defense budgets. If we need to shift policing funds to spending priorities like education, health, and safety at home, we must also shift defense budgets to the same ends. This is not only because defense budgets are endlessly ballooning and producing insecurity abroad, it's because there is a sector in the US economy that directly profits from and entrenches racialized state violence. Counterterrorism is a big business in this country that sustains not just the Pentagon, but also local police departments, border enforcement, FBI, to the tune of $3 trillion in the first 15 years of the war on terror. Government agencies compete for the discretionary funding made available by this huge slush fund. And they have incentives, including local policing incentives, to characterize minority communities and dissidents as threats that enable them to use so-called counterterrorism funds in everyday policing activities. We need to understand that the so-called military-industrial complex is in many ways actually a military-industrial policing complex that produces financial funding incentives to characterize minority communities as threat. In other words, a counterterrorism serves as what I describe in the piece as a kind of gravy train, a racist gravy train. And unless those funding priorities shift, it's very difficult to shift the racialization of national security and domestic policing. So I'm just going to conclude by saying dismantling this kind of racialized national security conception that also underlies domestic policing means recognizing the continuum of security state violence that connects domestic policing, border enforcement, and foreign wars. Thanks.
Thank you for that, Asla. That was a tour de force, which we have come to expect from you. But two things I just wanted to tease out from that. One, the concept of the military-industrial policing complex, and really just tying those two complexes together in the way that you do in the piece and the way that you succinctly did right now, I think is a really powerful thing. And then also the idea of connecting not just defunding the police as a goal, but also defunding the endless wars as a goal, and connecting those two things as being integral, actually, because there are the ways in which they sustain and support each other. And I think that provides a really good segue for thinking through some of the contributions that Monica Bell made in her fantastic piece on Black security and the conundrum of policing. Professor Bell, in that piece, you pushed the boundaries of what the concept of security entails and highlighted the importance of reframing and centering affected communities' vision of security. And so I wanted for you to expand on that, if you can, with us on how you perceive domestic issues of racially unjust policing fitting into broader conversations about national security.
Great. Well, thank you first so much for having me be a part of this event, you know, and also a part of the symposium. You know, is an interesting type of invitation because I think, you know, people who tend to do the type of scholarship that I do, which is largely focused on domestic racial inequality within the United States, often don't think of ourselves as part of a conversation about national security. So part of this conversation was a challenge for me to push my own thinking about where my work fits into these conversations. And also, I think, you know, I love the project because it provides a space to bring together, it both brings a race lens to national security, but also challenges scholars of race and inequality to bring a national security lens to our work. So I just wanted to elevate that point. So with respect to where I see these conversations fitting together, the first kind of impulse I have is to kind of start where you did, Professor Sirleaf, which is to talk about how usually conversations about national security focus on the state and really focus on state boundaries and specifically conceive nations as political jurisdictions, but not so much nations as a people, as about constituting a people. And so this is, I think, when we kind of expand out from thinking about the nation as a state, as a political jurisdiction, but as a people, that provides us a way to have more of a lens that centers racial injustice and racial inequality as quite important for even beginning to have a conversation about national security altogether. Moving beyond that point, there's also, when thinking about the security of Black Americans as being part of American national security, that can operate both on a conceptual level and on a practical level. So I would say part of the project of conceiving Black people as being critical to a conversation about American national security at a conceptual level is seeing Black people as part of constituting this people, which is aspirational, right? Like, so, I think there are many people who would make a claim that basically because of the founding, because of processes of enslavement, and also because of other deeply rooted, both historical and contemporary mechanisms of racial inequality, is wrong to actually include, to think about marginalized groups, including Black people, as constituting part of the American people. But it somewhat builds more into the aspiration of racial inclusion at a national level to have this conversation. So it's basically to say, if you're one of these people who wants to believe that to have that kind of to live out the idea of America is in fact to have maximal inclusion, and that's something we should be building toward, then to have a conversation about national security without deeply including the perspectives of marginalized communities in conceiving what security means is fundamentally flawed. At a practical level, I think we've all heard the sort of old story about Black soldiers coming back after World War II and wondering, why did I have more freedom when I was fighting abroad than when I was returning home and facing the specters of segregation? So at a really practical level, to basically racial discord, particularly of the type that President Trump has stoked, actually at a practical level threatens national security in multiple levels, both at a state level and as a people. So part of what I was trying to get to in my piece is to have a more textured view of what security means to Black Americans, as particularly with relationship, and this is kind of related to Oslo's point, particularly as it relates to policing in the United States. And there has been this, there's a lot of discord over the defund and abolition movements and what they actually mean for the lives of Black people. So if you've, for example, traced some of the coverage of defund and abolition in the New York Times, just as one example, not in the op-ed section, but in the news section, a lot of that has Black elected officials and who represent marginalized communities say, wait a minute, we're not with this defund and abolition thing, because actually Black people care about being safe and care about their own community security, and there's a way in which the defund and abolition conversations don't talk about that in their view. That's their view. So I think what that does, though, is flatten Black communities' conceptions of what security actually means. So one of the things I do in my piece is to talk about some of the qualitative research that I've done, and I have examples from Baltimore and DC, but this is something that's come up in cities across the US where I've done research, which is to say both a deep critique of the insecurity created by policing, especially in urban contexts, and also a desire for something that is safety or something that is security that does not actually look like more policing. And so part of the impulse is to say we need to have a granular conversation about what it actually means for Black Americans to be secure. And that should be a critical part of our conversation about broader national security. In recognition of time, I'm going to stop there, but I'm happy to engage in any additional questions.
Thanks for that, Monica. I know that we definitely could have gone on with that piece because there's so much there. And what I love about having the three of you in conversation with each other is because, as you're saying, it sort of challenges sort of folks who tend to look more externally to look more internally, and those who focus more internally to look more externally in ways that I think provide profound connections. And your piece definitely does that and is in conversation with Asla's piece and also with Nora's piece. And so Nora, I wanted to ask you about your piece on extrajudicial executions from the United States to Palestine. You powerfully discussed the value of Black Palestinian solidarity and understanding the relationship between US and Israeli state violence. And so I wanted you to expand on what you believe the value of that framing is and to connect that to the work that you've been doing on thinking through anti-imperialism. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Professor Sirleaf. What an honor to be with these powerhouse intellectuals and advocates. I do want to say, and it merits saying because it's directly connected to this, is just the representation of who's here. I know, and Asli will remember this, where we've been at conferences together, and I'll look around and say, the conversation about national security will by and large marginalize our voices because we're seen as biased. Because even though we're bearing the brunt, I'm speaking as a Palestinian, right? Or other representatives of marginalized communities, we often bear the brunt of these militarized forms of what becomes encapsulated in national security framework, thereby diminishing our contribution as either being biased or which frames us all together as a threat. So to the extent that we would speak on providing local knowledge on who we are and how to find us and how to capture us and how to, win our hearts and minds, but not in a way that critically examines the threat and the instability and the insecurity precisely as Monica was highlighting. We are seeking security as well. So how do we define security? How do we define the nation security for whom? And so this conversation very much also overlaps with a developing field, which I participate in, known as critical security studies, that also tries to, answer these questions. So thank you for bringing us together and for spearheading these efforts. In my article, I wrote this summer from a difficult and a very personal place and so a trigger warning, when my 27-year-old cousin was gunned down at an Israeli checkpoint, separating two Palestinian cities on the day of his sister's wedding, when he was running errands for the wedding. And anyway, the long story short is that there is no investigation. There is no question whether there was, a mechanical error with his car or that he committed a human error. Immediately, it was framed as an attempted car ramming incident and a terrorist incident, notwithstanding the fact, and here we should trouble this again about, questions of security and violence, that in the case that it was an actual car ramming, it was targeting soldiers, if that was the case, which then should put it into question the terminology around terrorism. We can maybe put a pin in that. But the point of that, and the reason I bring it up, is because the fact that he was gunned down, that he had his arms up, that he was left to bleed for over an hour, that the Israeli ambulance that came to treat the lightly wounded Israeli woman soldier, refused to treat him, that the Palestinian ambulance was denied access to him, and that immediately his car was impounded and his body continues to be held in a morgue at Tel Aviv University. because this state wants to use it as a bargaining chip in a prisoner exchange with the bodies of Israeli soldiers held by Hamas, which, you know, there's so much to unpack here. But one of the reason this goes to the question, Matiangai, is that I was, you know, a lot of Palestinians ask me, why aren't you saying that, you know, Palestinian lives matter too? There's so many resonances here that would make this obvious that this isn't about security. This is about, you know, dehumanization of Palestinians altogether, and about the obscuring of state violence that they struggle against. And I refrain from using the analogy for a few reasons. Number one, the ethics of solidarity, of not wanting to inadvertently take attention away from Black uprisings. It's been 400 years, and you know, our Black communities, our Black cousins are still struggling to just say Black Lives Matter without, you know, causing anxieties. So that was one. The others had to do with the fact that there's something about a flatness of an analogy. And I was really concerned about losing the texture, you know, the language that Monica uses about losing the texture in that analogy by doing so and making this somehow about identity politics, and which it's not, and then losing what's at the heart of it, which is an anti-imperial analysis. That Black Palestinian solidarity has historically been a critique of imperialism, which conceives of racism and colonialism as co-constitutive structures. Right? And even if we think about in, you know, the apex of a third world revolt, it wasn't Black Palestinian solidarity, it was basically Black internationalism and solidarity with the world. Today it becomes, and since 2014 and the simultaneous occupation of Ferguson and the bombardment of Gaza, it crystallizes as Black Palestinian, but remains anti-imperial. And so what I use in my piece on extrajudicial assassinations is I use that framework to tease out and to show how the treatment of Palestinians, right, within a national security framework is actually incredibly racialized. And how that happens and how that racialization takes place through legal technologies within the Israeli Supreme Court, as well as military law, the apparatus of military law. And then I use that same framework to think about the Black liberation struggle as not just a struggle against racism, but a struggle against colonialism, that the US remains a white settler colony against which, you know, the reason there's a fight for inclusion is because who is supposed to be included? Who does the nation belong to? And so that the move is not merely to be included, but to actually decolonize, right? Which aligns then with indigenous struggles and other peoples of color and other marginalized communities who are not to be included, but to continue to be racialized, continue to be targeted. And so looking at extrajudicial assassinations, whether it's shoot to kill policy of Palestinians in what become theaters of war, which is everywhere Palestinians live, or extrajudicial assassination of Black communities from lynching through the present, and what the Civil Rights Congress reminds us in 1951, that historically lynching was done by a rope. In the post-World War II period, it becomes the policeman's bullet, right? To bring that into the present, to think about the continuity of these colonial and racist legacies.
Man, there's so much there, so much richness from all three of you, and unfortunately, too little time. So what I wanted to focus on right now, if I could, is to tease out a strain of what a number of you brought up in your comments. And I think part of it is reflecting sort of how white supremacy governs, one, what's perceived as a threat in terms of national security, who's perceived as an expert to speak on matters of national security, and how racialized populations, subordinated populations, are subsumed or subjugated in frameworks on national security. And so I wanted to give space for anyone who wanted to expand on what counts, who counts as a target, and how that is informed and shaped by larger attempts that facilitate racial subordination. And so this is open to whoever wants to jump at it.
I'll just jump in at the outset to just follow up on a couple of points that Noura made that connect directly, Professor Ngcobo made that connect directly to your question, Professor Sirleaf. We can trace the way that the logic of counterterrorism connects directly back to depictions of national liberation movements, so that imperial, anti-imperial moment can be seen right there. And this is the Black International that Professor Ngcobo was speaking about, a moment in the era of decolonization when this logic of permissible and not permissible violence, insiders that are entitled to use violence and deploy violence at home and abroad, wherever they may choose, and outsiders that are first designated domestically, right? A domestic racialization of communities of color internally, whether it's through dispossession of indigenous communities or legacies of slavery and their aftermath, then are used, that internal racialization is projected abroad and continues through responses to these national liberation movements. And so what you see is allegations of sort of disordered violence requiring brutal intervention, whether it's policing at home or policing of the Black and brown peripheries of the imperial project abroad. And at some level, it's the framing of internal enemies read as national minorities that becomes part of the plastic language then of terrorism. And then that language, interestingly, because the United States dominates multilateral organizations, the way that the United States conceives of terrorism and counterterrorism, the racial project of the United States, itself then gets sort of made available as a technology internationally. So to be embraced by other governments, other states, to characterize their own internal enemies, their own internal others, their own internal marginalized communities using this same language. So it's not just that the US racial project gets projected abroad through US direct action, but also that it metastasizes through the entire logic of the way international security is conceptualized as a framework that can be deployed by any state to essentially racially police its internal dissidents, minority communities, marginalized communities, and others, however the nation chooses to define itself. And so that logic of insider and outsider becomes weaponized, not just in the hands of the US national security state, but as a kind of language of security more broadly.
Thanks for that.
Yeah, so just to, I guess we're supposed to have more of a conversation here. So my reaction to your question, Professor Sirleaf, really focuses more on the kind of perceptions of who is an expert about security issues more generally. And so I think this, I may be missing something, but this could be picking up somewhat on what Professor Bali was saying about the kind of way in which American perceptions of kind of who constitutes a terrorist or an outsider, et cetera. So we see this a lot in conversations about policing domestically as well. And so this is another focus of my piece, which is those who are perceived to be experts in kind of safety within communities are those who are most detached and those who have exerted the most power in terms of crafting the kind of safety infrastructure. And so in the context of policing right now, academics are playing a really troubling role, especially social scientists are playing what I would perceive to be a really troubling role in terms of defining the terms of the debate altogether. So instead of how to create security that actually speaks to the concerns of marginalized communities about what security entails, instead the question is more or less policing. What historically has contributed to the decline of crime rates as defined in a very particular way, as kind of dictated by those who have already been in power, determining the crimes, determining what's illegal and what's not, determining, as we've seen in the non-indictment of Breonna Taylor's killers, defining what is even understood to be illegal altogether. And that, I think, is a consistent logic across the domestic and international divide. This kind of conversation about power and the definition of terms and the articulation of measures has been really critical.
Nora, did you want to add something here?
I mean, I wanted to add just a couple of things. One is,
okay.
One is just to emphasize this idea of, what Professor Bali has described as military policing industrial complex, and then that connects with what Professor Bell is saying about inclusion, is that the framing of Black protest as counterinsurgency, because within it is the seed of, decolonial futures, what can threaten the entire project. Right. And so that's not a mistake, that's where, those tactics have circulated back. It's not a mistake of the framing of the BLM movement today as, Black, as extremists, or as Trump has called them, terrorists, right? That this remains, in James Baldwin's terms, occupied territory is occupied territory, whether he was talking about Harlem or we're talking about other places of U.S. warfare. And then the piece about, who counts as, you asked, who counts as a target, right? That's such a central question, and something that I've been grappling with, because when you think about, and here this is about just humanitarian law, one of the bedrock principles is the principle of proportionality, that you shall not use force that is disproportionate to the military advantage that you seek to achieve. And yet how you determine that proportionality is never defined by the affected community that's targeted. We don't ask the communities that are pulverized, or who, suddenly their wedding has been disrupted by a drone, missile. Well, was this proportionate to whatever, the military advantage, military tactic was, or the target was, which is oftentimes not even articulated, and then much less overseen. There's no oversight of what that is. And so the question of who is a target also overlaps with who is an expert, because oftentimes the targets don't get to weigh in on that proportionality assessment. And then, I'm just going to raise this without going into it, which is to say that, within those of us who are studying national security law, is tracing the way that the law itself has diminished who counts as a civilian, so that you can actually kill much higher numbers of targets who never even register as civilians at all, who are then, who then allow the belligerent, actor to say, well, that was a proportionate strike, right? And this goes into works on human shielding and the rest of it that we can discuss.
Well, no, that's powerful. I mean, I was thinking about the connections between sort of who counts as a civilian, but just also who just counts as a person, right? So if we think about the number of, from Ahmaud Arbery running while Black, to Breonna Taylor sleeping while Black, so like who gets to exist as a human being, right? Who gets the protections of a human being? Who's allowed to exist in a way that's not perceived as a racialized threat? Is something that I think both domestically and internationally is sort of exemplified in the ways in which you see the devaluation of the lives of people of color from here to Palestine. And so I wanted to give an opportunity to the students to ask a question. And so thanks to the Yale Law National Security Group for organizing. One of the questions that I have coming from them is, to promote racial justice and national security, some focus on diversifying the composition of national security policymakers. Others argue that having a more diverse group of policymakers will achieve little without changing the structures and ideologies under which national security policymakers operate. How significant of a distinction would you make between having a racially diverse national security space and a national security space that promotes racial justice? And if you could, discuss where should advocates for racial justice focus their attention? Anybody?
I'll chime in really quickly on this, just from an analogy to the U.S. policing context. So, I mean, it's pretty clear from the U.S. policing context that diversification, which really became the core of one aspect of the civil rights struggle in the 1960s. There was a huge move supported by the U.S. Civil Rights Commission to diversify police forces. And so you had situations where, major I'm in Washington, D.C. right now, and in D.C., the police force shifted to being ultimately about 90% Black in a city that was, majority Black. And there was a sense, theoretically, that would mean that there would be substantive changes into the ways that policing operated, and what we actually saw was even more kind of death and kind of carelessness about the lives of Black people. And this is because the culture, the blue culture, and of dehumanization of Black life and other marginalized life is about the nature of the institution. So if you're taking some of the lessons that we've learned from Professor Ericott, Professor Bali in this conversation, it's pretty clear that you cannot just diversify your way into racial justice. You instead have to shift the culture of institutions. And so what does that mean? There has to be a broader education and understanding of some of the connections that we've talked about today that flows into structures of governance in international institutions. I'll leave it to my co-panelists to talk a little bit more about what that looks like at a granular level, but from this vantage point, it's like absolutely diversification of policymakers is not going to take us there.
I'm just going to echo that, absolutely. And just, you have an object lesson in the Obama administration of a far more diversified policymaking body. And of course, in some ways, the transition from the Obama administration to the Trump administration demonstrates that it does matter who holds the office at some level, right? I mean, it's not that it doesn't matter at all, but it is, while necessary to diversify the kinds of perspectives and backgrounds that inform so-called expertise and that then flow into policy, it is in no way sufficient. It is absolutely insufficient. In fact, all that the Trump administration, all that President Trump had to do is come in and really amplify and expand upon the existing programs that he inherited from the Obama administration, because there was no fundamental commitment to what I think is a very important framing choice that you made, Professor Sirleaf, in this forum, which is to center not just race and racism, but systemic institutionalized racism, subordination and anti-subordination agendas, and racial justice. I mean, to just say we're going to racially diversify doesn't actually address the underlying structural phenomena that Professor Bell just pointed to. And indeed, we need to understand these. I mean, the project is a transformative project. It's not an incremental reform project, ultimately, because it is the law and policy frameworks themselves that are doing the racist work. That's what it means to have an analysis that says this is about structural racism, right? They are the frameworks that enable and reward racial subordination through policing. So for example, targeted enforcement and regular recourse to disproportionate lethal force, which connects exactly also in the international arena to what Professor Ericott was just saying about who counts as a civilian and who doesn't. These are doctrinal choices. It's about decolonizing those frameworks. And if you can have a rainbow coalition of policymakers that have no critical perspective on the fundamental way in which those policies and frameworks produce these racialized outcomes, and if that's what you get, you may have marginally better, than some of the folks that have populated this administration, but you're not going to get change.
Jump in, Nora, jump in.
I mean, I don't know if it's okay for your forum. My head's about to fall off. I'm nodding so enthusiastically. I'm like, yeah, me three, absolutely. I just want to, just to add to this and kind of, that also brings up the work, the identity politics of it, right? I think identity politics are rife with concerning issues, that it's not about representation. It's about not the representation just of groups, but the representation of ideas, right? And so it's not that I want my CIA to be headed by a woman. Hello, right? That's not going to make it any better. It's about what are the politics of the people who are filling these positions, right? So here we get at the heart of how diversity has been recently highlighted as shallow, because it doesn't take that into account. Who gets to represent me is what matters. So even in thinking about Black Palestine solidarity, it's not these groups have not become aligned because of static identity, but they've become aligned. It's what Robin Kelly has said. It's Black leftists and Palestinian leftists. And so in very much the same way, if I want to think about diversity, I don't want it just to be as was in 2003, where the Undersecretary of State that was part of the machinery that waged the US war on Iraq was an Egyptian woman. That didn't matter. Right? It didn't matter that she was Arab if this was the politics that she was espousing. It's really about what are those politics? How do, and for me, that gets to the question of dismantling the institution, of actually targeting these systemic problems rather than just making it more palatable, right? Or more representative.
Thanks for that. I mean, I think all three of you were resoundingly, against sort of changing the face of power, as if that a power which subordinates racialized communities, as if that in and of itself is sort of a measure of success or of achievement. Like, oh, look how many brown and Black and Latinx faces we have in a system that is still serving to marginalize those communities, whether that's domestically or internationally. And so I think that part of what's clear, or actually most of what's clear from your comments, is that it's certainly not just about diversity when the substantive policies remain the same. Another question that I have from the students is, do you think that national security in the US can move past centering sort of nationalist, white supremacist, American exceptionalist ideas, given the way in which the field has developed and been framed in practice? Is that a thing? Discuss.
I'll maybe jump in here again and just very briefly say that this requires a much broader reckoning, right? You don't start, I mean, you're not going to be able to displace a fundamentally white supremacist conception of the nation by rethinking national security alone. Like, it requires a kind of grappling with history, identity, the sort of identity formation process that makes nation have a one-to-one correspondence in the minds of so much of the US, not just the policymakers, but publics, as a white Christian nation. I mean, how do we conceive of our border, just as an example, and what would it mean to decolonize that border when Black and brown bodies at the border are systematically excluded in ways that, a person that is racialized as white is able to cross that border with almost no questioning whether or not they're fully documented. I mean, this is a reality of how we choose to treat our understanding of who constitutes this nation, who are the insiders. And until that is addressed, and addressing that, by the way, requires something more than just, it does require a kind of transformative engagement with law and policy along the lines I was suggesting earlier, but it requires more than that. It requires grappling with our history in ways that speak the language of reparations, for example, actual restitution. I mean, this is not, these are forms of damage and harm and injury we can't even begin to articulate the scope and magnitude of within the terms of our current national conversation. And so long as we're bounded in this conversation, so long as we're not able to address, confront, and fundamentally make reparations for the histories that have produced this conceptualization of nation, it's not beginning with national security that we're going to be able to really displace the centering of white supremacists.
End. Or does anybody want to add anything to that? I know Asla said all of the things, but if anybody wants to jump in, please do.
I just wanted to point out one thing, and this is the nerd in all of us, but just thinking about colonial legacies and even thinking about the establishment, right, of the League of Nations and the post-World War I order was the concept of the equation of self-determination with the concept of the consent of the governed, that so long as the natives agreed to our dominance, therefore they were democratically participating, that this idea of the diversity of representation has historically been manipulated, and I think will continue to be manipulated unless we, in order to basically make us consent to domination, unless we target, the logics of it. And so part of those logics are what you pointed out, Professor Sirleaf, on American exceptionalism, which I think is at the core of this discussion, that the US is not exceptional from the rest of the world, does not have the position and the moral authority to be the global police that absolves it and places it above any kind of specific, rule of law order or global order. And part of what's been disrupting that American exceptionalism has happened just this past summer when we saw 18 different countries actually participate in solidarity with the BLM movement. When we saw Sweden place sanctions on the United States, that it would not transfer tear gas to the United States because they could not be trusted. They did not have, they have a responsibility to protect, and they did not meet that responsibility in protection of their civilians. And also the idea that this has been taken up once again within the UN organs that are questioning whether or not the United States is practicing institutionalized racism and should be held to account for what would count as crimes against humanity. I mean, all of that disrupts that idea that the US is exceptional. And I think it's a great step in the right direction in this paradigm shift.
Professor Bell, did you want to add anything on that? Okay, so I wanted to, in the last couple of minutes, I was hoping that we could have a discussion around just sort of what bringing a racial analysis to issues of national security, what are the benefits and what are the limitations, if we can think about that by way of any concluding remarks, because we have about 7 more minutes. And so whoever wants to go first can go.
Okay, sure. I'll take the anxious response and just and make my closing remarks now with respect to that question. So, so of course, I mean, I think we've talked a lot about what the benefits of bringing a racial lens to national security are, and I feel benefited as someone who like to bring a national security lens to conversations about race domestically. But there are also, of course, a number of limitations to just say, okay, we're going to talk about race now and national security, and one is the potential limitations of thinking at a granular level about processes of racialization across multiple complex contexts. And so I suppose there's some worry that in trying to develop a global paradigm, we could lose some of the particularity at a local level of how marginalization plays out. I don't think that's a grave risk because I think the larger benefit is important, but that's one sort of concern. And I also think there's a degree to which sometimes our conversations about racialization leave out particular mechanisms of imperialism, colonialism, and kind of capitalism and other sorts of means of economic exclusion, that if we're not careful, if we don't have a careful enough analysis of processes of racialization, then we might overlook some of those dynamics. So I think the key is what it means to bring race to national security also means to bring particular processes of racialization and marginality to a conversation about national security. And so those are my initial reactions. But I also want to thank you for including me in this conversation. And I want to thank the panelists for a great learning experience, certainly for me.
I'm going to go because I don't want the last word. So let me do this. I want to echo also the gratitude of just, and Professor Sirleaf knows this, that when I saw what was happening on Just Security's pages, I mean, it cannot, especially for the cadre of law students, that this is a big deal. This is a big deal to have a forum that wants to render race visible in national security, because it's been unnamed. And it's also been, not to take for granted the successes and the advancements that have been made by, the most recent Black uprisings that we're bearing witness to, is to also usher this, to create this paradigm shift where we don't guffaw at that proposition, but instead are reckoning with it. And I think that's, I hope to see a lot more of that to come, which is a reckoning, right? A reckoning within our various disciplines. And that also applies to, those of us in Middle East studies, a reckoning of how have we not grappled with race as a race and racism, not just as social phenomenon, but as things that merit study and greater scrutiny with the granular texture that Professor Bell has urged us to use. So I think that this is the beginning of a lot more in national security, in Middle East studies, in other fields that I look forward to. So thank you again.
I somehow have ended up with the last word, which I didn't intend, but actually I'm going to give it to you, Professor Sirleaf. So I'm just very briefly going to say, I think the analytic payoff here is made really clear in this conversation and in all that you curated, Professor Sirleaf, on the forum, in making legible and visible the dynamics that produce outcomes in national security that don't get named. So we've said this already, but I just really want to underscore. So for example, if I want to talk about the political economy of national security, I need, in my view, I need to have an analysis that understands the racial formation of threat, because that is the way in which, for example, a local police department accesses those discretionary funds made available to them in a counterterrorism frame. So what does it mean when the Department of Homeland Security announces that cities can compete to become pilot members of a new program that's going to have, you know, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars available to it? What it means is that the Black and brown people that live in that city better be very aware of what incentives are being provided for their local officials, whatever color the police department might be, whatever, however it may be populated. Its funding incentives are going to be driven by a broader racial project. And while we may understand in some ways what it looks like to think about federal and local funding and how do these, you know, pipelines operate, we don't actually think about it, particularly not at the national security level, carefully through the lens of race. And so bringing what has been an unbelievably rich domestic conversation, for example, about the school to prison pipeline, and thinking about how those very same types of dynamics operate and are shot through policy and law across the board, including in the area of national security, makes it possible to talk about and design research agendas that have just been completely, not just marginalized, excluded, absent, just invisible. And that, I think, is an enormous service. And you have really produced a forum that can engender that kind of research, that can inspire the law students that Professor Ericott just spoke of. And I think it's a, you know, unbelievably rich area. So thank you. I just want to thank everyone on the panel, but especially you, Professor Sirleaf, for getting us together and making this possible.
Thank you guys. You're far, far too kind. I mean, I have to say that this project is definitely standing on the work of giants who have been sort of toiling at the margins, trying to bring these conversations to the center. And so I think it, as you said, rightfully, Professor Ericott, the sort of confluence of things has forced actually the powers that be that deal with issues of national security to consider and to have to do so in a meaningful way, the ways in which issues of race and racial justice impact not only sort of national security, but domestic, other fields in domestic law more generally, and certainly in international law. And thinking through sort of the way in which you all artfully talked about how dissidence, but I would also say existence, how dissidence and existence gets read as threat because of racialized fears and the ways in which people of color are coded as constantly being in threat, even from merely just being, is something that sadly we see sort of reiterated in Black and brown communities here in the United States, and then also replicated abroad, as both of you have talked about. And we've also seen sort of the ways in which technologies of subordination are traveling internationally and domestically. It's such that when we saw over the summer, and even prior to then, sort of militarized tanks and police in sort of militarized gear in a number of cities, and the aghast response of people, you know, where is this? Where are we? And it's like, well, also too, where have you been, right? These tanks have been there, right? These forms of militarization have been there in communities of color. It's just now more broadcast on your TV, and just because maybe it's now less so on the TV doesn't mean that it's gone away either, right? And just because you're not seeing the ways in which these things are connected internationally, it doesn't mean that they aren't connected either. And so that's why I loved having the three of you in conversation with us today. I know that we are slightly over time and the students have other obligations like class and the like. And so Tim, I didn't know if you wanted to say a couple of last minute things to just wrap us up, thank you guys. Thank you, Professor Bali. Thank you, Professor Bell. Thank you, Professor Ercott. You guys are phenomenal. And I wish I could continue talking to you all afternoon.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm so glad we were able to have such a rich and educational event. So just one last time, on behalf of the Yale Law School National Security Group, thank you so much to all of our panelists and to all of you for attending.